Hello and welcome back to COM 340 Rhetoric and Popular Culture. Today we're going to be talking about persona. And persona is all about looking at a text and thinking about the author, creator, or source of that text, but then also looking at the imagined or actual audience for that text as well, but specifically how the text, specifically how the artifact lets us know about the author and the audience. Persona is detectable through the artifact itself because it's in part a direct result of it. So let's take a look. The first persona is the first persona. It's what we encounter first. So let's learn a little bit about it. It's the implied I of a text. And what we mean by that is that first we've got to understand that all messages, all texts have an author or a rator. Things come from something, right? We can't get something out of nothing. And when it comes to messages, it's typically messages that are shared by people, by entities, by personas in some way or another. Basically, all content has a creator. We have people that are called content creators who create content, but regardless of what the content is, someone has made it. And typically, more than one person. It's been created and developed, especially when we look at popular culture. A lot of times, the texts that we're looking for are the result of long and collaborative processes. However, because that's true, a single person then is not always the implied author, rator, or creator of a text. Sometimes the implied authorship, who we're putting that I distinction on, um, can be different and difficult to discern. And then once we have it, rhetorically, there are implications. So, for instance, take a look at this response to a tweet. We have, if the beef is never frozen, then how do you guys keep it fresh? And Wendy's responds, refrigerators, which is funny, right? Aha, good comeback, Wendy's. But if we ask ourselves, who's the creator of that tweet, right? Of the Wendy's tweet, we look at Wendy's. What does that mean? What does that represent? Is it Wendy's the entire corporation? Is it Wendy the mascot? Is it the person Wendy who that mascot is based on? Is it just the social media director for Wendy's? Or is it just the employee that is in charge of tweeting? There's a lot of different ways that we can understand the implied author of the tweet, especially when we get an example like this. If it's a book, it's a lot easier, right? The writer, or maybe if we want to be inclusive, the writer and the editor and any ghostwriters that there might have had. A YouTube video is typically the person who published it, right? And again, we can include editors and camera people if we want, but the implied authorship is the person that we see most on the channel. And so when it comes to tweets, especially tweets from corporations, corporations functioning as people and having a personality, should be interesting to us, right? Because it's always Wendy's is not a person, and that we can communicate them as if they were is kind of strange. But let's talk about the second persona. The second persona is the you of a message, or the implied auditors. What I mean by that is that when we are writing, when we're composing something, whether it's a text, whether it's an essay, or whether it's a story, we're writing to an implied audience, or at least we're writing with the understanding that there may be an implied audience. And you can be your own audience for a text. That's fine too. But there is a who or what you are writing to or writing for. And that's because texts speak to imagined audiences. Um, the entire world cannot be your audience for a piece of text. One, language barriers, right? And access to the message and things like that. And so imagine audiences are inherently smaller than the population that could interact with them. So that means that they're tailored, they're directed, they're pointed at something specific, our texts. And if you're going to put a message out into the world, if you're going to create a text, if there's going to be an artifact there, then typically it's created to be consumed and audited, whether it's reviewed or just simply watched and enjoyed by an audience. And though it is imagined, it's particular. And by particular, I mean it has a makeup. You've got a target audience. In branding, this is really easy to see, right? Because you're aiming your marketing, you're aiming your advertising towards people that have the disposable income to purchase it, that have a connected or vested interest in what it is or does, or people that identify with the same characteristics that you've promoted as part of the product. So in advertisement, that particular audience is pretty easy to see. However, all messages have that particular audience, and it can be more difficult to tell what it is when we're dealing with more nuanced media than advertising. But since we brought up advertising, um, oh, sorry, going back, that's coined by Edwin Black, the rhetorical thinker Edwin Black. It's important to know that. Okay, so this advertisement from Mountain Dew fascinates me. I love advertisements like this, in part because this is less an advertisement and more a mini documentary. Beautiful shots here. We have the Arctic, it's cold, we've got ice, and giant waves, and then we have this person swimming out to do the do. But what have they done before that? They've gone out and swam and surfed in the Arctic with an extremely impressive wetsuit, and then we're told to do the do, which is fascinating. And when I see a commercial like this, I always think about persona, because I ask myself, who is this commercial for? What is the intended audience of this commercial? And Mountain Dew does this. They aim at two very distinct and also very different groups when they advertise typically. One, we have people who participate in extreme sports. You'll find a lot of snowboarding, surfing, skateboarding commercials from Mountain Dew. But then also they're really into advertising towards gamers. And their various partnerships, be it with Taco Bell or Doritos, are aimed at gamers and giving away consoles or special skins or rewards for games. So when we look at a commercial like this, how are we supposed to understand it, right? Who is the implied audience? Who is this for? Is it for extreme athletes? I don't know, maybe. Is it demonstrating to a broad public sort of what Mountain Dew sponsors, what they're all about? Potentially. I don't think, although there might be those simple connotations, I don't think it's explicitly, if you drink Mountain Dew, you will be able to do these things. Like that's not what they're implying, but there is the connection between an extreme sport athlete and someone who drinks Mountain Dew. And so the implied audience there, the implied auditors, are likely picking up on that, whether it's subconscious or not. But there is another persona, which is a direct result from the second. And this is the implied exclusion, or the they. So what we have is an I position, the I persona, the first persona, which is the author of the message, the creator of the content. The second persona is the you, or the intended audience, the imagined audience for a text. And the third persona is the they, or the people that are excluded from the intended audience. And this is important to understand because just as the imagined audience of a text includes a particular population, it inherently also excludes a population as well. And it's as simple as the idea that messages are constructed to be for the imagined audience. That means intended for them, constructed for their particular tastes and for their consumption. As such, there must be, as a result, another imagined audience for whom the message is not for, or basically the sum total of all people. You have an implied audience, which is a certain subgroup of that total. And what you have left over then is your imagined audience, that subgroup that you've basically sectioned out, and then the rest of potential audiences are then excluded. And people are excluded based on what the topic is, the intentions of the message, as I mentioned before, having access to the message. And it's important to pay attention to who is excluded from a message, because a lot of times people are excluded consciously, but not seemingly on purpose, if that makes sense, right? Where messages are very specifically tailored to exclude people or to signal things to certain people and not others. And so we need to be able to rhetorically deduce those things. That way we can be better interpreters of communication. But here is an important quotation from Philip Wander, which I think really does a great job of explaining the importance of understanding what a third persona is and also why it's important to have that understanding. And he writes, "The third persona, therefore, refers to being negated, but being negated includes not only being alienated through language. The objectification of certain individuals and groups discloses itself through what is and is not said about them, and through actual conditions affecting their ability to speak for themselves. Negation extends beyond the text to include the ability to produce text, to engage in discourse, and to be heard in the public space." So while we can look at a text or a message with pretty low stakes and identify an author and potentially identify an intended audience, when we identify implied exclusion, especially when we look at what the message is saying for the intended audience, that it's not saying for the excluded audience, then we get to reveal some of the inherent negation and potentially oppression that society bakes into how we talk about ourselves. And so while we look at branding a lot in this class because it's so not necessarily obvious, but it's so readily apparent sort of what's being attempted, if we look at something like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, even the national anthem, and look at the text to see who is included and who explicitly is excluded, right? When they say that all men are created equal, we know exactly who was counted, right? Because these people wrote about it. And a lot of times fights for justice, especially rhetorically, come from making sure that people are included in messages that talk about things like equality and justice. Because it's only when everyone's included in those terms that we actually have those ideas, right? Until everyone's included in that phrase, all men are created equal, then it doesn't mean anything. It's not justice, right? And so justice, a lot of times, advocacy is about making sure everyone's included in big terms like that. And to basically, from a rhetorical perspective, if we don't do the work to see who is excluded, then it becomes extremely difficult to get them included if they've been negated from a message like we're talking about here. We will go in more depth in this as the week continues. I hope you enjoy it, had a good weekend, and we'll continue, like I said, talking about this as we move forward.